To broadcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Activity Colored AFA webinar. I'll give it another minute just to let everyone get dialed in. All right, I'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Activity Colored AFA. My name is David Falstein, and I head up the Client Strategy and Success team here at PERSUIT. And at PERSUIT, we are reinventing the outside counsel engagement process. So we're really excited to speak with you guys today. A little bit about me. I have a background in law and sourcing. So I did a JD MBA program at Michigan State. And I focused on law firm pricing, and actually I wrote a thesis on alternative fee arrangements. And then before coming over here to PERSUIT, I supported the in-house counsel team at Johnson & Johnson to negotiate AFAs. I also ran some RFPs and reverse auctions on the PERSUIT platform. So I'm excited to share about what I've learned about AFAs, and also I look forward to hearing your perspectives as well. In our last webinar, AFAs 101, I went over the various types of AFAs and their pros and cons. So today I want to present a new type of AFA that I think will work a little bit better than many of the traditional AFA types. But I'm actually really curious to pull you guys into the conversation and to get your thoughts. So as I go through the presentation, you're welcome to submit questions through the Q&A. So if you want to text questions, you can click the little Q&A button in the Zoom. You can also click the raise your hand button. And once you raise your hand, I can actually call on you, and then you'll be prompted to unmute yourself. So feel free to speak up at any point if you want to ask a question, or if you just want to challenge me and tell me that, that I'm completely wrong. I welcome any feedback that you have. So I'll go ahead and dive into the content here.
So potentially in the demo clause, we tell this guy that we'll pay for a year and a half of storage.
So, okay, just mute somebody. All right, so why do we need AFAs? So I'm gonna start out with a question to the audience. So I'll go ahead and launch a poll here. Okay, the poll has begun. Do we actually need AFAs? Question for you, the audience. Yes, badly, meh, yeah, I don't know. Or no, hourly billing is absolutely wonderful. We have no need for any AFAs. You know, no, there's no wrong answer, except for the wrong answer, which, you know, I'd hope that we get some diverse. Okay, we got about 51%. So some of you still sleeping on the dial here. I'll give it a few more seconds before we end the poll. All right, I'll go ahead and end it. So I'll share the results with you all. So the answer is yes, we badly need AFAs. 81% of the audience says yes. 15% are not sure why they dialed in. And 4%, I'm really not sure why they dialed in to learn about AFAs. Hopefully the 4%, the one person that thinks hourly is great, can raise their hand and tell me a little bit of why you think that the AFAs are absolutely horrible. So I invite you to raise your hand at any time if you have a question or a comment, and share your thoughts. I actually think that hourly billing is really problematic for several reasons. The first being that it's unpredictable. Even though a firm is asked by their client often to give a budget, that budget is usually worthless. And the reason why is because the client isn't giving the firm any kind of detail on what's going what type of activities are going to be required of them, how many firms are they going to pull into the case or the M&A deal or whatever the project is. So the firms don't have much information. So usually those budgets are pretty worthless. Also, the most critical reason why AFAs are problematic is because they incentivize the firm to bill more hours. They incentivize inefficiency. And so that's a critical reason why we need alternative fee arrangements. Another problematic element is that hourly rates, you may think that you have a great negotiated hourly rate, but hourly rates are only half of the equation. And I'd actually argue that they're the less important half of the equation, because you might have a 30% discount, but the firm can bill you more hours to make up for that. Also, an hourly rate can't take into account a really critical and important element, which is leverage. So leverage means that the firm, how much is the firm delegating work from the senior partners down to junior associates. A firm could be very, quote unquote, expensive in terms of their hourly rate. But when you actually compare the total cost of that firm representing you versus another inexpensive firm, the expensive firm may actually be billing you in total less, because they're great at delegating the work down to the appropriate people to handle various tasks. And they may not have 50 people billing you on the case. They may have a very lean team. And so that's why hourly rates are really the much less important element in the discussion. Also, a point about trials. So hourly billing is really a fiction when it comes to huge bet the company trials. The firm may have 45 attorneys billing you on that trial, but does the 45th attorney add any marginal benefit in that courtroom? Or is it just a way for the firm to bill as much as possible to compensate for the fact that they're representing the client and it's a really critical case? So there's a high amount of value that they're providing. So are they just trying to get as many people on there to compensate for that? So it kind of becomes a fiction in that instance, and it'd be much better just to have a fixed fee agreement where you're paying a set amount per week or per day for the trial. So I'll open the floor there. Any questions, comments? Anyone disagree with anything I've said so far? Please feel free to click the raise your hand button, and we can go ahead and call on you. All right. I don't think we have any questions coming in yet. Everyone's a little bit shy.
Hey, David, can you hear me all right?
Hey, John, how's it going, man?
Good, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, no, thanks for the webinar. One question I had for you, or if you could just expand on this a little bit, but how would you explain the difference between activity collared AFAs and the activity-based fixed fees?
Okay. Thanks for the question there. So just to give a little bit of description, and I'm going to get into this too here as we get a little bit further in the presentation. So the activity collared fixed fee. So you may have heard of a AFA model where you actually pay a set price per activity, and there's no actual total price. There's just one set price per activity, and you would just get billed as those activities arise. But with an activity collared fixed fee, you have one total price, and you define the number of maybe 5 to 6 major cost drivers. So in this example on the screen, you define 20 fact witness depositions, for instance. And then the actual total price would not change unless there was a material deviation in the quantity of those fact witness depositions. So if there ended up being 30 instead of 20, then that would be a material deviation. And so that would trigger a change in price. And so that's sort of how the activity collared fixed fee works. So I'll get into that a little bit more as we kind of go on here.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the.
One question I'll add then before that, and I actually heard it at the Buying Legal Council when I was speaking with another company, and they had mentioned, well, if you've got a fixed fee, why would that be preferential as opposed to, say, a capped fee, right? And of course, I had my answers, but maybe
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, that's a great, and so a capped fee is really so dependent on hourly billing, and the reason why I think a fixed fee is preferential is because when you say we're going to do a capped fee, all the risk shifts to the law firm. So the client is saying, bill us up until the cap, and then beyond that cap, we're not going to pay anything more. But if the billings end below the cap, then we'll just pay you for whatever you billed us for. So it's completely one-sided in favor of the client. But that actually ends up hurting the client because it incentivizes the firm to set the cap way too high. So then the firm ends up billing you up to that cap, but the cap's set too high. So it kind of doesn't really give you the outcome that you're looking for in terms of getting true cost containment, which is why I don't. However, if you were to competitively bid, let's say bid out to 4 or 5 firms in an RFP and ask for a total capped fee to handle the entire case, and that RFP was a reverse auction, and so firms could see where they rank, and then they lowered their prices accordingly. And then, the auction ended and the client chose, an affordable, chose a capped fee that actually wasn't set too high. Then in that case, it would kind of work. But I generally think fixed fees are a better way to go. I don't know if anyone disagrees with that, or John, or do you have any experience doing capped fees, or do you mostly do flat fees?
No, mostly now flat fees, but as companies try to ease into AFAs, cap fees is a great place to start. So, especially if you can competitively bid it. But it's kind of a good starting point. If you're like a little nervous that you might be overbilled, it's kind of a good way to start with. You don't have to worry about potentially being overbilled, and so that it is a good. I agree with you that it'd be a good starting point. But that actually is a really good segue into my next slide here, which is what I think is the reason why a lot of clients they say that they want AFAs, but then they don't actually follow through, and they don't actually have their firms do an AFA, even though the firms are ready to do it. And that's because the clients are scared of overpaying. So I want to ask another poll to the audience on this topic. Overpaying. Okay, question for the audience. Is there such a thing as overpaying for an AFA? And I want you to ignore the possibility that there's a full-on case settlement or dismissal. So ignoring that, so the scope, so you define, there's going to be, let's say you have an M&A deal, you define all the activities that are going to take place in the M&A deal. The project happens as it should happen, and then it ends. So there's no change in scope. Or you have a litigation case, you define exactly what's going to happen, and what happens. So there's no major material deviation and no change in scope. But you still want to know, did I overpay for is there such a thing in that scenario where the scope hasn't changed? Is there such a thing as overpaying? So I'll give it a few more seconds for everyone to submit their votes here. And again, a full case settlement or dismissal, if you were to pay obviously you agree to $1 million and the case settles or is dismissed within, a few days, obviously there's a concern there of overpaying. So I want to ignore that possibility. But so let's go ahead and end the poll and then share the results. Okay, so 44% are not sure. 30% say no, and 26% say yes. So very split audience here on whether there is such a thing as overpaying. Okay, so in my opinion, there is no such thing as overpaying for an AFA where the scope has not changed. And the reason is that you've defined what it is you want. The firm has given you a price for the work that you've defined. That's the price that you pay. How can you overpay if that's the work that was performed? The amount of hours that ultimately the firm billed on the back end should be insignificant, should be irrelevant to you at that point, because
you're paying exactly what you agreed to pay for the exact scope that you asked for. I mean, if the case was to settle or if it was dismissed early, then you would need to adjust. And so I always recommend that you define, well, what is a material deviation? At what point would we need to have to, if the case settles, at what point would we say, okay, we have to renegotiate this? And that's really the key part of the activity collar at AFA that I'm going to get into, is that I think it does a really good job of handling instances where there actually is a huge material deviation. But in cases where there's no material deviation, I'd argue you don't need shadow bills, and you shouldn't have to ask for them, because the scope hasn't changed. If you were hiring a moving service and the movers moved exactly how many items that you agreed to pay them to move, and then you asked, and you came in and said, well, we should pay you less because you actually moved our couches quicker than I thought, that wouldn't happen, right? Also, the whole point is that the firms are going to be able to bill less hours in a fixed fee agreement. They're going to find efficiencies because they're now no longer incorrectly incentivized to bill you more because they're not on hourly arrangements. So I think that that's a really important thing, that the clients, we need to get over this fear of overpaying, because especially if you competitively bid, and that's why we push so hard for people to use RFPs before you select a firm, is if you define the scope of work and then you get multiple proposals from firms, you have a true market price for the cost of the case, and so you definitely don't need to worry about overpaying. But then that kind of gets me to sort of the next point here, which is, how should we measure the success of an AFA? And so there's different benefits for the client. For the client, do we have a question or a comment from someone? Oh, all right. Let me go ahead and mute. Okay, so for the client, a key measure of success is paying less for the same type of project than you did last year. So getting a true cost reduction. It gives the client predictability. That's another key measure of success. It should give the client some flexibility in the case of a material deviation, but it also shouldn't be so complex that you cannot figure out how to bill. And it would, you don't want to have to be having 20 calls with the law firm billing manager, pricing manager, to figure out how to go about billing for it. So that's just too much work. And then for the firm, a measure of success should be that in the AFA, the firms earned a higher profit percentage on the same type of project than they did last year. Flexibility and simplicity are also key measures of success for the firm. Which brings me to basically my next point is that these are not mutually exclusive. Firms can be more profitable while charging less. So I'm curious to see if you guys agree with me on that. Can firms be more profitable while charging less? So I'm going to ask that as another poll question here. Okay. Question 1, do you believe that RFPs create a race to the bottom? And question number 2, is it possible for a client to pay less to the same firm on a similar project as it did in the past while the firm profits more? In other words, can firms profit more while charging less? Is that possible? All right. We got some interesting answers coming in here. I'll give it a couple, 10 more seconds. Also, just a reminder to anyone that joined us late, you can click the Q&A button on the Zoom to be able to type a text question if you don't want to speak. You can also click the raise your hand button. And if you raise your hand, I'll be notified, and then I can actually allow you to speak and unmute you, so that way you can give your opinion or ask a question. All right, I'll go ahead and end the polling here. I'm so proud of everyone here for saying that 94% yes, the firms can profit more while charging less. We need to educate the two people that don't believe so. Do you believe RFPs create a race to the bottom? Wow, 39% say yes, RFPs create a race to the bottom. So to me, these two questions kind of go hand in hand, because if you launch an RFP and you're encouraging firms to lower their prices, then they might have originally been comfortable paying or charging in the past on an hourly basis. You're actually getting a more competitive, lower priced AFA. And by doing that, the client is paying less, the client's saving money, but the firm can still be profitable, more profitable in that scenario. So how is it a race to the bottom if the firm can be more profitable while charging less? And so I have an example here to share with you. So let's say, take an example where this is assuming the same exact firm is doing the work. In year one, the firm is handling an investigation of medium complexity, and they charge at the end of the investigation, the hourly billings end at $400,000. The firm had 5 attorneys on the project, and the firm had a 20% profit margin. So the internal costs were $320,000. So they profited $80,000. Then in year 2, the client decides to buy PERSUIT, and they launch a competitive RFP reverse auction for the investigation. And they get 5 proposals starting at $400,000. At the very end of the auction, the auction ends, and the same firm that they used last year, they decide to select again. But this time, the firm's final agreed price was a flat fee of $300,000 for investigation of a very similar or the same exact fact pattern as the prior year. This time, the firm is not billing hourly. They're able to actually leverage the project and use some lower cost resources. Maybe they only have 2 or 3 attorneys on the project instead of 5. Maybe they leverage technology and they manage the case in a way so they're actually leveraging the same work product as before, and they can actually be more efficient doing so. So now their internal costs have lowered down to $210,000. So the firm actually has a 30% profit margin in this case, and actually profits $90,000. So it makes $10,000 more in profit. Despite saving the client $100,000, the firm is still able to profit more by being efficient, by having proper leverage, reduce, and then they've also freed up 2 attorneys to work on other projects. So now the client or the firm can bring in more volume of work on other deals, other projects, and profit more. I have a greater profit percentage. So I'll pause there. If there's any questions, welcome any questions or comments. All right. So we go ahead and move on. So I think I've said enough and made my case in terms of why we need AFAs and how they can actually be beneficial for both the client and the law firm. Now I want to talk to you about the activity collared fixed fee. So when I was in my last year of law school, I did a ton of research, and I did a directed study under a professor named Ken Grady at Michigan State on alternative fee arrangements. And the whole goal was to try to figure out, what's the best kind of AFA out there, and to learn as much as I could about all the AFAs that were being utilized. And then while I was at Johnson & Johnson, had an opportunity to work on several different AFAs. And one of the things that I noticed is that there's really currently 2 types of AFAs. There's our AFAs that are just completely hourly dependent. And so they actually don't give you the predictability that you need, like sort of the capped fee AFA is still very dependent on hourly billing. And then there's other flat fee AFAs where you just say, here's a flat amount we're going to pay for the entire case or the entire M&A deal, let's say $1 million, and that's not going to change. And so then you're worried, you're worried about there might be a huge change in the case. You never know exactly what's going to happen. Things could ramp up and double the amount of work that you originally anticipated could end up being required. And so quickly what I realized was that the most important thing to figure out when you're doing an AFA is how are you going to account for changes? Are you going to do a 6-month review and just say, hey, we agree to this amount, and then in 6 months we'll review and figure out if we need to make an adjustment? And if that's a good way to start, just to say in 6 months we'll come back to the table and discuss how to adjust it. But then you're having to renegotiate the whole thing if you don't define actually how are we going to adjust it. If we said that there was going to be 10 depositions at the start and there ended up needing to be 30, and then you come back and all you've said was like flat fee for $1 million for the case, what do you do when you have your 6-month review period? How do you handle that fluctuation of 10 more depositions or 3 more motions than you originally anticipated? If you don't have a mechanism to know how to deal with that, then you're constantly having to renegotiate. And so that just ends up being really time consuming. And so the idea behind the activity collared AFA is that you define the quantity of activities. In this example, we have a $2 million litigation matter. And we've defined, these are six really important activities that make up the bulk of that litigation matter. So we got fact witness depositions, expert depositions, document review, motion for summary judgment, motion to dismiss, and Daubert motions. And we've agreed that these are the quantities of each activity type that we think is going to be required. It's just an assumption. We're absolutely not sure, but this is what we think based on prior experience. Looking at our historical invoice data, this is what we think is most likely going to be required. And so we use those insights, and then we say, okay, we're gonna assume this many, and then in 6 months, or at the end of the case, we're going to come back and do a review and say, okay, we assumed 20 fact witness depositions. How many actually were required? Oh, it turns out we only had 10. Okay, well, that would trigger a material deviation. So in this example, in the bottom right, I've defined material deviation trigger as a 30% increase or decrease in the assumed quantity of the activities in these 6 categories. And only these 6 categories matter. So if you told me, okay, we thought there was going to be 50 hours of research, but there ended up being 70 hours of research. Nope, that's not going to trigger material deviation. We agreed to one lump sum bucket for analysis, strategy, and research of $500,000 in this example, and that amount will never change. So there's basically six material deviation triggers, and then there's a bucket for everything else, and that bucket will never change. And but if it does turn out, okay, we had 10 fact witness depositions instead of 20. Okay, that's more than 30%, a more than 30% change. In this instance, is more than a 30% decrease in the quantity of fact witness depositions, and we have a price here per activity. So we agreed at the start that fact witness depositions ultimately are $20,000. So if we had to reduce the number of fact witness depositions, we'd be reducing the total by $200,000. If we had to reduce it by 10, we'd be reducing the total agreed amount by $200,000. On the same token, if we needed 30 fact witness depositions, we'd be increasing the total agreed price by $200,000. So you're not actually paying $20,000 per fact witness deposition, but you're agreeing on what the price for that deposition would be if we had a material deviation and we had to add more. And that way you're not having to renegotiate the entire thing. You're just adjusting the total price based on some pre-agreed, pre-negotiated amounts. So I'll pause there for any questions or comments on how this might work. And John, I know that you typically do flat fee arrangements at GSK. So, but I'd be curious to know whether you think that this is something that you guys have done in the past, or something that you think may have been possible. I don't know if you're still there with us, but love to get your
I'm
thoughts.
still here. Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of what we do, to be honest. As far as how we try to construct our compensation models, I mean, I think it's really important to look at the top cost drivers, even if you don't know, the quantity. Like you said, you got to put a stake in the ground. And then when there is material change, at least you're negotiating with more intelligence than you would have had if you didn't, originally state that. So
when you do a flat,
yeah.
do you typically define like have a material deviation clause that's based on do you allow like an hour? Do you allow a number of hours change to be a material deviation, or do you have like
no.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely not number of hours. But it's more of like the quantity and what you've defined in your assumptions, depending on what the matter is.
Okay.
And I think that's really important. I mean, if you don't do that up front, then, I mean, you're not going to reap the benefits of, especially an activity collared fixed fee.
Okay. Thanks for that. All right. Any other comments from the audience? Just go ahead and click raise your hand, and we can get you into the discussion. I know we got a lot of law firm participants here, so be curious to hear your side of the story here. Nope, everyone's really shy today. Okay, we'll move on. All right, so this is sort of an example timeline for how the activity collared fixed fee can work. So if you take the total agreed price, so you got a $2.02 million agreed price, and then you do divide that into 12 months, and then you'd bill that equal, the firm would bill an equal amount of that $2,169,000 every single month for a year. And then 6 months in, you could have a mid-year review. But in that mid-year review, as John mentioned, you don't look at hours. You look at, okay, how has the scope changed? Has the number of key activities changed? In this example, okay, we need 20 expert depositions. We actually conducted 20 expert depositions or 20 sales rep depositions. And in this example, I'm using experts, but it could be anything that you've defined. It could also be in an M&A context. There was maybe significantly more documents in the scope of the diligence. So there's a material deviation, and then you use the pre-agreed amount to adjust. So in this case, there was 10 more required, so we would adjust the total amount by $500,000. And so then the firm would bill a $500,000 adjustment true up at that point, and then continue billing the rest of the months at the $169,000. And at the end of the year, we review again. There was no more changes. So the total amount that we ended up paying is slightly more than we originally agreed at $2.52 million versus the originally agreed amount of $2.02 million. So I think this is a relatively simple way to provide flexibility. So you still have an ability to adjust, but that flexibility isn't based on hours. So you're not just resorting back to a true hourly arrangement. So let's go through the pros and cons here of this model. So the pros is that, so if you think about a traditional, everyone may have heard the idea of a collared fee. So typically a collar, you set a total price, and then you say like a 10% collar around that, and then the firm bills hourly. And if the hourly billings go beyond the collar, then there's a 50% discount to incentivize the firm not to go beyond the collar. And then if the firm's billings come in under the collar, then the firm and the client share the savings 50-50. So this collar is different because the collar is based on the quantity of key activities. So there's essentially a 30% collar around the quantity of depositions, the quantity of motions for summary judgment, etc. And so only if the quantity of the key activities change materially, that's the only way that there will be an adjustment. So it's less likely that there will be a price adjustment, which is nice. It also provides you total cost predictability, and then it uses a liquidated damages like approach. So if there is a material deviation, you've already agreed what the per activity price will be to adjust. So you're not having to figure out how many hours were billed and let's adjust based on the additional hours that were billed. You already know how much you'll adjust by. So it's really more like a liquidated damages approach when you have to renegotiate. But the total price is fixed. So you're not actually, the firm isn't tracking every single activity that is performed. You're also not you're not defining every single possible thing. You're only picking the 5 to 10 major cost drivers and using those as your material deviation triggers. So if the client or if the firm had to research 20 more precedent cases, that hasn't been defined. So not every activity has to be tracked. So it's a little simpler than just paying per activity. The cons are you still have to have a regular cadence to check if there's a material deviation. It's not just a pure flat fee. Also, another con is you have to negotiate a fair amount for these bucket tasks, like analysis and strategy. So in my example, I had a bucket of $500,000 for analysis and strategy. Well, that's still a little bit vague and still kind of hard to forecast. So that can be a challenge with this approach. Is how do you agree to that total amount? And which kind of gets back to the ultimate theme is that bucket amount should be competitively priced. So if you engage in an RFP and obtain an activity colored AFA proposal from firms on PERSUIT, you're going to allow the market to dictate what is an appropriate amount for the analysis and strategy, what's an appropriate amount for expert depositions, what's an appropriate amount for motion for summary judgment in a competitive environment. And then once you agree to that, the final proposal after you've reviewed the qualitative background of the firms and all their other substantive questions that you've asked them, you can make an informed decision and then have a really predictable way of knowing how much you're going to pay, throughout the course of the year. So that pretty much concludes my content here. So I'll go ahead and stop there if there's any last questions. If not, I really appreciate everyone's time and thank you for joining me today. We'll be doing a lot more of these webinars as we go on. The next webinar, I believe, is going to be on RFPs for litigation matters. And so how to set up an RFP and things to consider when you launch an RFP for litigation matters will be our next topic. So I'll definitely invite you all to that. And hopefully you'll join me again. Any questions, comments from the audience before I wrap up? All right. Thank you all so much for joining me, and we'll speak again soon. Oh, actually, we just got a question. Oh, not a question. Thank you. Thank you, Divine, for joining us. Feel free to type your questions as well if you have any. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.